In our last session, we began to see some of the challenge of John's teaching, where he's telling us that we need to show that we've turned to God and repented by the way that we live. And we've started to see that as we unpack that, it gives us this challenge of what it truly means to be saved. As we unpack that, what we start to realise is that we need to understand the nature of salvation. And as we look at what Jesus taught, as what John the Baptist teaches, when we look at what the disciples who are with Jesus teach, what we see Paul teaching through his letters, is that there's a clear responsibility that having made a decision to make Jesus the Lord of our life, having made a decision to be born again, having confessed with our mouth and believed in our heart, we're transformed as a person. We're transformed as an individual, that we get an eternal security, but with that eternal security comes a responsibility for how we live, and a responsibility to continue on in our faith and to remain connected to the vine, to remain in Jesus. And when we start to understand all of that, it gives us a really huge question to ask, which is, can we lose our salvation? In our last session, we saw that Paul clearly taught in Colossians 1 that we had to continue on in our faith once we'd made that decision, that he seemed to be writing that our salvation was linked to continuing on and to continuing in the faith. But one of the difficulties with Paul is that when you look at all of his letters, there are different things that he writes, and you have to cross-reference across, and some of those are a bit difficult because they appear to contradict themselves. So on the one hand, Paul has written that we must continue in the faith, and in his letter to the Roman church in Romans 8, we see him writing that those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of his Son, and that those he predestined he called, those he called he justified, and those he justified he glorified. Now that sounds a little bit technical, but I want us to just try and put it into some simple terms to help us understand some of this. Because a lot of Christian theology revolves around some of these things. When Paul's talking here, and he's talking about being predestined, for John Calvin, when he was writing his theology that a lot of the church over history has believed, he took some of these verses and linked it to what was called election. And what he said is that God has a foreknowledge. God is omniscient. He's all-knowing. He knows the end from the beginning. God sits outside of time. So he was there at the beginning of time. He's there at the end of time. He sits outside of time, and he knows everything that has ever happened and will ever happen because he's all-knowing. That in itself is a concept that is so mind-blowing. I don't think our human minds can truly understand that or take it in. But because of that, God has foreknowledge of who's going to be saved. And consequently, this theology around the idea of election, that God had elected some people to be saved, begins to develop a theory around what's called predestination, that some people are predestined to be saved, which by implication means some people are not. I said before, I grew up in a church where predestination was part of the belief of that church. The effects of that were that they effectively said, God is going to save who he's going to save, so I therefore don't need to do any evangelism because my eternal destiny is so secure. I can't change the eternal destiny of people who God hasn't foreknown or predestined or chosen in advance to be saved. Maybe when you start to understand that, you start to realise some of the challenges of why theologians argue and why theologians debate what salvation truly means. When Paul writes these verses in Romans 8, he says those he predestined, he called. In other words, there's a sense of a calling, an invitation to faith. And that those he's invited to faith, he justified, he made right with God. And we've talked about justification through the work of Jesus. And he says that those he justified, those he made right, he glorified. In other words, are given eternal security and have a place in that eternal kingdom of God. The implication is that it suggests that God knows in advance who's going to be saved, and by implication questions whether we truly have free will.